I look forward to that. The G7 used to be the G8. Barack Obama and a person named Trudeau didn't want to have Russia in the G7 summit. Will have to do with just 6 leaders here in Canada today after President Trump's abrupt departure last night. Thank you in Canada, but you probably see what I see. And I have to be back as soon as I can. We're going to have dinner with these wonderful leaders. And then I get on the plane, I have to be back early. It was supposed to be a summit, a meeting of the world's most powerful economies high in the Canadian Rockies. But before Air Force One even touched down, the G7 had already fallen apart. There were no smiles, no unity photos, no carefully worded joint communicate. Instead, there was silence, strategic, surgical silence. Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney scrapped the summit's final declaration before negotiations had even begun, a move so unprecedented, so deliberate that even the White House had no time to respond, the usual choreography of global diplomacy. The handshake photo, the final signatures. The signal of unity was deleted, and in its place a diplomatic vacuum, a vacuum that spoke louder than any press conference ever could. This was not diplomacy, it was defiance. Before we continue, hit that like button to help us beat the YouTube algorithm and to show your support for the United States. This summit had already become a battlefield. President Trump landed in Alberta, not to unite nations but to demand submission, 5% military budgets, more tariffs, threats of economic punishment, and beneath it all, one comment that shattered any remaining illusion of partnership. A campaign speech from March where Trump told a crowd in Ohio that Canada should have been part of the United States from the start in Ottawa. That was not rhetoric. That was a red line, and Carney's response was swift. Kill the communique, a cancel. The joint photo strip, the summit of its symbolic power, and leave Trump without a single diplomatic souvenir to carry home. According to Bloomberg, Carney's aides called it a signal that Canada would not lend its name to what they now see as economic coercion, masquerading as diplomacy, and the fallout, immediate. The G7 had no unified document on climate, no agreement on trade, no shared language on global security, just a chair's summary, an administrative footnote instead of a political statement. Macron's delegation called it a historic breakdown. A German official called it tactical silence, but no one called it accidental because it was not. This was the first G7 since 1975 where the host nation refused to validate the summit, and the implications are staggering. Carney, once a reserved central banker, is now orchestrating a quiet rebellion against U.S. dominance on the global stage. But that rebellion was not limited to words in the days leading up to the summit. French President Emmanuel Macron made an unscheduled detour to Greenland. The move was symbolic, calculated, and piercing. It came just weeks after Trump once again floated the idea of annexing the Danish territory. Macron's presence there alongside Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen was more than a diplomatic gesture. It was a shot across the bow. Greenland is not a bargaining chip, Macron said, arms crossed on the tarmac. The timing was precise, the message was global, and the target was unmistakable. At the same time, Japan filed a new complaint with the World Trade Organization alleging that U.S. aluminum tariffs violated international agreements. Mexico arrived armed with legal countermeasures, bracing for a new round of cross-border tariff escalations. The United Kingdom negotiated a last-minute digital trade exemption, but only for 12 months. Financial services excluded. This was not coordination, it was containment. And behind closed doors, the U.S. was being blamed for destabilizing the global economy again. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button to show your support to the channel. Trump's 10% universal tariff announcement now affects more than $1.1 trillion in imports from U.S. allies. Canada alone has been hit with a 22% tariff on dairy, 10% on aluminum, and 14% on lumber. According to Statistics Canada, that cost the country's manufacturing sector over $4.2 billion in the first quarter of 2025 alone. And the anger, it is no longer hidden at a closed-door session. Carney was blunt. Canada will not use its federal budget as a metric of military compliance. That was in direct response to Trump's demand that every G7 nation spend at least 5% of their GDP on defense. France and Germany echoed that pushback. Even NATO officials called the request politically unworkable. In the absence of agreement, Trump found himself increasingly isolated, and that vacuum created something far more dangerous than disagreement. It created narrative collapse. No closing statement, no final press conference, no posturing. Just the optics of a world leader flying home empty-handed from what was once considered the most important economic summit of the year, and it gets worse. The World Bank's June 2025 Global Economic Prospects report downgraded global GDP growth by 0.7%. The reason retaliatory trade measures and tariff uncertainty, primarily originating from the United States, that line was not buried in footnotes. It was on page 1 according to the same report, Capital. Inflows have dropped 12.4% globally this quarter, the sharpest contraction since early pandemic recovery. Meanwhile, the United States has revoked 6 bilateral trade exemptions in just 90 days, and it has imposed tariffs on over $1.3 trillion in imports since Trump's second term began. Carney's decision to strip the summit of its communique denied Trump one of the few things he values more than control optics. There was no moment of validation, no handshake to tweet, no signature to hold up for the cameras. Instead, Carney did something far more strategic. He gave Trump nothing, and in diplomacy, nothing is sometimes more powerful than any word behind the polished images of mountain resorts and closed-door or sessions. The summit looked less like a forum and more like triage Germany's. Friedrich Merz arrived under pressure from Berlin's exporters who've lost over 17 billion euros in U.S. trade volume this year alone. Japan's Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba faced fresh tariffs on aluminum and threats of Section 232 investigations into steel. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum brought legal defenses after the Department of Homeland Security signaled it could double border tariffs if Mexico does not adopt a U.S.-style asylum system. And then there was Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister invited as a guest by Canada, currently under investigation by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police after reports of state-linked political violence against Sikh activists surfaced in Toronto. That investigation loomed over every side meeting, every handshake, and every photo. This was not multilateralism, it was crisis management. And Carney, by refusing to paper over the dysfunction, may have just done the one thing no G7 leader has dared to do since the forum began. Admit the G7 no longer functions as intended. The group's founding purpose was to coordinate economic growth and defend the post-war order. But today, under Trump's trade-first allies' second approach, those values have evaporated and the world has noticed. Macron's team, working with European Union diplomats, activated new tariff defense measures. If Trump escalates duties on EU machinery by 17% as he has threatened, the bloc is ready to retaliate. Automatically, Japan has called for emergency WTO mediation. Mexico filed legal memoranda before even stepping off the plane. The G7 is now a shell. What was once about shared goals is now about damage control, and Carney's silence. It was not weakness, it was control. No need to chase headlines when you designed the frame, said one senior Canadian official to Bloomberg, and that frame is now global. According to the Associated Press, every G7 nation except the United Kingdom is currently facing active U.S. tariffs, and even Britain's narrow exemption only lasts until March 2026. So the question becomes, how long can this summit model hold if the host refuses to sign? The guest refuses to compromise, and every other country arrives just trying to protect themselves. What exactly is left? The Canadian Rockies were chosen for their isolation. But this time, isolation became strategy. Access roads were closed. Protesters were pushed over 50 km. Out the Royal Canadian Mounted Police enforced a full lockdown, the first of its kind since the 2002 G8 in Cananesis. No leaks, no chaos. Just a curated silence that left Washington flailing for a message, and that silence worked, because while Trump's team scrambled to refocus on NATO spending, they could not fill the void left. By the missing communicate, Carney had denied Trump his prize, and he did it without ever raising his voice. This is not the end of the G7, but it may be the end of the G7 as we know it, because what happens next will not be negotiated in summit halls. It will be decided by how allies prepare for the next confrontation at NATO, at the WTO, on the borders of Ukraine and the Arctic, in trade routes and procurement orders, and cross-border energy flows. The summit in Alberta was not a climax, it was a signal flare. Carney's refusal to close the summit with unity was not defiance. It was a new diplomatic doctrine, a warning that symbolic loyalty no longer buys silence. And if this was only the G7, then NATO, where money, troops, and hard power are on the table, will make this look like a warm-up. Do not blink, because the real rupture is still.
Fuel costs, higher sticker prices on cars that once rolled in cheaper from Ontario. Unifor, Canada's largest auto workers' union, labelled Trump's tariffs economic sabotage, a deliberate attempt to undercut Canadian manufacturing in favour of American producers. Except even American producers were being hurt. The logic had failed, and companies were taking notice. Canadian firms that once assumed the US market would always be safe were now adjusting, scaling back US sales, opening offices in Berlin, Jakarta, and Dubai instead of Buffalo or Chicago. One Canadian executive said it plainly: "We are telling our clients in America, your government has chosen to make you pay more." And in some cases, US clients are walking away, but others are staying and paying the price. So now the question is not whether Canada can decouple from the US, the question is how fast. As trade wars escalate, the difference in strategy is undeniable. Ottawa is not playing chicken. It is building a network, a firewall, a new global web of economic alliances that treat volatility like a threat and stability like gold. And the world is responding, because when one side builds walls and the other builds bridges, the message is not lost on multinational CEOs. As Mary Young said, predictability is no longer optional, it is essential. And if the United States does not restore that predictability soon, it may find itself more isolated than protected. What began as a disaster had become a strategy, reshaping the very definition of trade routes between Europe and North America. Further north, Denmark faced its own reckoning. In Esbjerg, the coastal wind capital of Scandinavia, turbine blades sat idle, some as long as jetliners. A brutal 30% tariff from the US had cancelled orders in a flash. Managers scrambled, projects were frozen, crews prepared for furloughs. But then came Canada. By April 1st, a green technology pact worth $1.5 billion was finalised. Denmark rerouted its entire renewable energy export network to Canada. Turbine blades bound for Arizona were redirected to Nova Scotia. Solar modules meant for Florida went instead to Saskatchewan. That same week, 150 Danish engineers boarded flights to Halifax and Regina. In industrial parks across Nova Scotia, 200 local workers were trained to install and maintain imported turbine equipment. In Saskatchewan, logistics centres doubled control about changing the fundamental calculations inside every American boardroom. Mark Carney, Canada's economic mastermind, had made his move. By choking the supply chain during peak production season, he exposed the United States' most vulnerable dependents and ensured that any company unwilling to localize would be the first to fall. And Deere did fall. But the pain did not end there. It spread. Farmers in the Great Plains started turning to brands they had never considered before: tractors from BYD, harvesters from Fendt, digital interfaces from CLA. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. China and South Korea moved with the speed of predators. BYD and NIO began cutting deals with American dealerships left in the lurch by Deere's collapse. European brands offered generous financing. Some even shipped parts directly to farms, bypassing American infrastructure altogether. As one farmer in Kansas put it, loyalty doesn't put food on the table. Working equipment does. Meanwhile, state governments began to panic. Governors from Iowa, Michigan, and Ohio, states that had voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, found themselves begging Canadian trade officials for mercy. Trump's tariffs had promised to protect American manufacturing. Instead, they left entire regions defenseless. The irony was devastating. With Washington offering no solutions, governors began cutting back channel deals. Some offered tax breaks to foreign manufacturers willing to build inside their states. Others looked to Mexico for new partners. The federal government, still preaching about national strength and economic independence, was being quietly bypassed by its own allies. And as the policy chaos played out, the emotional collapse continued. Cafes closed early. Local banks saw deposit withdrawals. Schools in factory towns began preparing for funding cuts. And the green fields of the Midwest, once dotted with deer machines, started looking foreign. Rural Americans, who had believed in the promise of protectionism, were now staring down the barrel of economic ruin. Grassroots movements formed. Some farmers launched lawsuits, others organized protests outside state houses. Many simply left, walking away from equipment they could no longer afford to fix or replace. And in boardrooms at John Deere headquarters, the panic finally set in. Executives called emergency meetings, stock values plummeted, investors fled. The company scrambled to retrofit plants in Iowa and Illinois, desperate to restart domestic production. But it was too late. Part suppliers had moved on. Former partners were hesitant to return. Workers rehired after months of silence found themselves assembling machines with outdated tech. It was not a comeback. It was a collapse in slow motion. Even foreign automakers began to take notice. In Japan, trade ministers huddled with executives from Toyota and Honda. The biggest is aimed straight at Canada's auto sector, something that employs thousands and is deeply tied into the US economy. The president does. He still has the tariffs against the auto sector and talks about making it economically unviable to make cars in Canada and to move it to the United States. The US auto sector, can it be VI viable if it's just an American auto sector? Canada, Canadian. We have a great auto sector, great auto parts sector. That integration of the auto sector is part of what will make North America competitive. Trump's threats to Canada's car industry are not just foolish, they're dangerous. Car manufacturing in North America depends on cross-border cooperation. Engines might be built in Ontario, transmissions in Michigan, and the final vehicle in Mexico. That's how the system works. Trying to break it apart with tariffs will hurt everyone. Carney knows this. That's why he called out the reality. The US auto sector cannot survive without Canada. Trump's idea that cars should only be made in America shows his lack of understanding about modern global supply chains. You can't just slap a flag on a car and pretend the whole thing was built at home. Canada's response isn't just defensive, it's smart. Carney is signaling that Canada is not scared of walking away. If the US wants to play hardball, Canada will find better partners. Already, Carney is increasing talks with the European Union and key Asian markets. Mexico, too, is showing interest in joint economic strategies with Canada. Strategies that may leave the US behind. In trying to punish Canada, Trump is only pushing it further away. What once was a deep friendship is now becoming a cautious, calculated relationship. Canada won't be bullied. It has options and it's starting to use them. For decades, Canada and the United States shared more than just a border. They shared trade, defense, manufacturing, and deep trust. But in 2025, that trust is fading. Prime Minister Mark Carney has made it clear the days of Canada, depending on the United States, are over. We are seeing the danger of over-reliance on the United States economically, and also from a security perspective. So we will cooperate where necessary, when it's in both of our interests very clearly. But we won't necessarily cooperate. So we as a confident country with an ambitious plan, we look outwards, we look to Europe, we look to Asia. We look to new partners that we're going to deepen with. This statement marks a turning point in Canada's history. Carney isn't just hinting at change, he's announcing it. Canada is done waiting for the US to act like a stable partner. It will now choose its own path with or without American approval. Carney's words are powerful. We won't necessarily cooperate. That's a clear warning to Washington. Canada is no longer under the US umbrella. It is a confident, self-reliant nation that can and will work with Europe, Asia, and other global players if needed. This is not just about policy, it's about survival. Trump's unstable behaviour, aggressive tariffs, and reckless diplomacy have made Canada realise that relying too much on the US is dangerous. Whether it's trade, military support, or environmental issues, the US under Trump has shown it's unpredictable. That's no way to build a future. Carney's vision of a one Canadian economy is also important. It means breaking down internal barriers within Canada